those people are human beings as well. Most of those, what they do on a Saturday and Sunday is probably, so it is, the best source of information is always going to be people who know who know. And like I say, I've met some great, oncologists, specialists, neurosurgeons who are very aware, they're very informed, they've either got lived experience and how do we get their knowledge in parts to us. But hopefully it'll continue to move.
About 3 or 4 years ago, this is just an indication of how much it's changed, the NHS actually commissioned a consultant to come out and work with us to talk about people's needs with and planned for, it's going to be an awful mess.
And anybody who's worked in a care home, I don't know, there will be a variety of people in this room, anybody who's ever worked in a care home will know that's really funny and really kind of not as well, because obviously as people get older, they get vulnerable, they have conditions, unfortunately, like dementia. The amount of incidences that we see that are really difficult to manage with people who, their sexual preferences is not, to tie people up and hit them with sticks. It's still really, really difficult to manage, actually. So if people are going back to a time where they were living their best lives, which is what happens with these kinds of illnesses, and their best times were, Torture Garden or other clubs are available, you are going to have a real interesting thing to manage. And the last thing I'll say on this question, because I do know there were other questions in the room, is ultimately that we're quite fortunate to live in Manchester. Some of the healthcare providers and services that are specifically commissioned for the community of Manchester, all different areas of Manchester, are some of the most liberal, open-minded and progressive that they are in the UK. We are aware of that. We do already look after a very diverse population of people here, and most healthcare providers will see us under that umbrella in one way or another. So we're quite lucky with that, to be honest. We're not living in a little village in the back and beyond who have no idea what we might be doing or what pride it is. So thank you for the question. Do we have, I think there's another one,
Yeah, I'm sure you've probably talked about this already, but just if you could, when we talk about things like aftercare, those pre-conversations on looking after each other, particularly people that have had previous experience of trauma, in terms of how we can look after each other and aftercare and those things.
Thank you. I think we do get this question regularly, of course we do, and I think we get it because it's such an important question and it's something that we need to reiterate time and time again. And I think trauma's interesting, isn't it? Trauma is something that, I guess when I first started into the BDSM community, we would talk about trauma and it would be, I had a very childhood, or these are things that have happened to me, and we do still have that variety, but ultimately I think people are recognising now that adverse life experiences, whatever they can be, are particularly traumatic. So a lot of people come into BDSM and find BDSM having just had one of those. They've had a relationship breakdown, a marriage breakup, they've maybe had birth trauma, they've had trauma that's loss, they have trauma that's associated with being, an adult and living a life. And how do we have conversations with people that, embrace that and talk about that and accept the whole of a human being? And I think that's really, really important. What I said earlier on about that, getting to know one another, making sure that you've had space and you've had time to have conversations before you jump into a scene. I know for some people, some of the time it works to meet at a club and to say, I'd like to do X, I'd like to do Y. But for me, I think we should always have that opportunity to hold space with each other over coffee, get to know one another, meet one another, do, those kind of social interactions before we play. And particularly what kind of play we're doing with somebody as well. I think, thankfully, we've moved away a little bit from, when I go back to the old days quite a lot, but it did feel like if somebody had a soft limit, that was something that we were supposed to push. It was something that we were, move the envelope, and it was kind of, a goal to get to that, to move it. And I think that is something that we see less and less of now, which is nice. And you can always do more. You can always go back and add to a scene. You can start with CP. That's quite light. I watched a really good workshop at the last LAMchester, and it was a mistress that I've known for many, many, many years, Mistress Brown, and she did a caning workshop, and she started that workshop talking about sensation play, talking about how do you like to be touched, Where do you like to be touched? Do you not like to be touched? What does touch do for you? You know, what are the rules around that? Is touch one of your love languages? Is it not? Because how you interpret somebody touching you will be very different depending on the answer to that question. You know, and we look at those things before we even think about getting a cane, and then we get a cane, and then we work up and we work up and work up and we add to it. And I think that's really, really important, you know. And if you have anybody who has any kind of trauma at all, that's even more important. You know, less is ultimately more. And how do we create a space where we can talk about vulnerability? Because that's ultimately, when somebody wants to talk about trauma, they want to be vulnerable. And I think as well, you know, we are coming to an understanding now that both sides of the slash, wherever you sit, you know, whether you're a submissive, a slave, a dominant, a top, a master, a daddy, a little, everything else that I've missed out in there, because there's lots and lots of things that we use to describe ourselves. You will have vulnerabilities that you want to share. You know, and like I say, when I first started, you had all your kind of people at this side of the slash, your submissives or your slaves or your littles would say, these are my vulnerabilities, please look after them, it's your job to look after them, you're the top, you know, these are the rules, you adhere to them all. And I think we're moving away from that, which is good. You know, both people are humans. They'll both have trauma, they'll both have vulnerabilities, they'll both have good days and bad days, and we both need to have an understanding of each other. And also, we need a real understanding of how to look after ourselves. I know it's quite controversial, but you go into a scene and you play with somebody, that expectation that they're going to be a caregiver available to us is not always realistic. If you're going into a scene and you're going to need 2 or 3 days of aftercare from that scene, and the person you played with is jetting off on holiday the next day, that's not going to work. You know, and we should have had those conversations beforehand. So how do we ultimately want to be cared for? That's always the first question. You know, what do we want our aftercare to look like? And if we're brand new to the scene and we don't know that, that to me is the first question to answer. You know, what is it that we think we want? And even if we're not sure, you know, what clues have we got from general day-to-day life? You know, do we like to be put in a blanket and snuggled up and be looked after? Do we want somebody to just leave us alone and give us a wide berth, and we want to go into another room of the house and chill with Netflix for a few hours because that's what we need? You know, are we going to go and have a shower? I'm a huge big fan of water. I use water to manage a lot of my emotions. So I might want to go to a spa that's been particularly grueling, but I definitely want a nice little shower. Do we know these things about ourselves already? What do we already know that we can transfer into BDSM, sex and kink? And then how do we share that with the people that we're playing with? And what I will say though is if you have a significant history of past trauma and that's something that you haven't had to work through, you really need to be transparent about that. You know, do you know how to ground yourself if you have a difficult scene? And do you know how to stop a scene if you're not happy? And a lot of people, when they've got trauma, you know, that's something that's really, really difficult. So, you know, if you play with safe words, for example, and somebody ultimately freezes or they perhaps become a little disassociative, is there another way of handling that? You know, are they going to hold something that they're going to drop, or are they going to have a different system of communicating? But I definitely think that's a sort of conversations and play that you have a lot further down the line. But that's not where we start. We start with the sensation play. We start with getting to know one another, and we start ultimately with getting to know ourselves. You know, it's the same answer in some ways. That Games User Manual applies to that question just as much as it does to that question. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah, thank you.
May I add something to that?
Yeah, of course. I'm welcome.
Especially the new to the scene, tops can say for it too.
Yeah.
And if you're having a bad day and you're not feeling it, you're allowed to call it too. And there's no shame in that either. It's not the safe word is not just for pattern.
Absolutely, and ultimately, you know, we do play with power and balance, we play with power dynamics, we play with all of that good stuff, and it, you know, can be really healthy. But ultimately, you know, my bottom line is human first, and we are all human beings, and we're all going to have good days, we're all going to have bad days, we're all going to have scenes that's just not working for us. And I think, you know, maybe a decade ago, there was this preconceived idea that, you know, tops and doms were infallible, and the reality is they're not kink dispensers, and ultimately we're not here to just be the whim of another person's kink either. It is about how do we communicate and how do we come to a relationship that's ultimately serving everybody's needs. We're all here to have our needs met, to have a great time, And one of the fundamentals is, and why we attend workshops like this, I hope, is to work out what those needs are. Because, we don't wake up and just know what we need from a relationship or from life, or what a life worth living for us looks like. Some of us, certainly for me, that's been a lifelong journey. So, do we have any kind of other questions? Anything else?
This might probably be on a little bit tonight. Sorry, but to be like information, I think something to kind of shame in terms of, for example, like I used like this and I used to use age regression as a coping technique from trauma that I used to have, and then slowly built it into like a lifestyle, but because of my past with I guess like dogs, I may feel like I have a lot of shame about that part of me, find it hard to like engage in that with it, like kind of normal, I guess. I don't know how else to explain it, and it feels like that part of me, which is such a huge like part of my life, is not really present anymore, and it, like whenever I think about it, it makes me feel like really shameful that I do engage in that, but I kind of don't need that. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. But you know what? In some ways, it's a really common question, and kind of not. It's one that I guess a lot of people probably think and feel, but aren't always brave enough to put their hands in mass. So thank you for that. I don't think you're alone in what you're describing, but I do have a couple of follow-on questions for you, because I just to clarify.
Yeah.
So when you're saying that you feel shame, do you feel shame because you've regressed within kind of sexual abuse and relationships to manage trauma, or is it shame of the age play dynamic in general? What's it?
I think it's kind of like a mix of all.
Okay.
It was never ever sexual for me. It was always just something I did.
Yeah.
Like therapy to make myself feel just kind of like
It was confident.
yeah. It was like